Hey guys, welcome back to the layout once again, and welcome to episode 2 of our Crawford scenery series. Today we're going to talk about track weathering. I actually did a track weathering video over 3 months ago now, and in that I talked about how to weather both wooden track and concrete track, and I did all of that by hand with like a paintbrush and just some acrylics. Today, however, we're actually going to do all the weathering with an airbrush, so that's very straightforward. There's really only 2 steps. We're going to weather, or sort of, not necessarily weather, but airbrush the ties, sort of a base whitish gray color. Then we'll come back, mask off the ties like you see right here, and then we'll weather the rails. And the reason I'm actually getting to the track weathering right now is because, you know, we're working on our overpass scene just behind you guys, and I needed to get the track weathered over there before I could finish that up. So that's what got me motivated to do this. Quick disclosure too, I would like for this video just to be more of like a generic how I weather track sort of video. In reality, the situation I have here is a little bit more complex because, as I mentioned a few months ago, I actually weathered this back track you see here. I weathered that one with a paintbrush, but I left the inside one unweathered. So down by the wall I had one track that was weathered, and now I'm coming back and weathering the inside track using an airbrush. So I've got 2 different methods there. And then if you look right here, I actually have 2 different kinds of track. I have Atlas right here, and then this piece in the middle is microengineering, and then it's microengineering on that way as well. So there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason to that. I got this track as a gift and I wanted to use it, and my rationale has been that the different appearance that the 2 tracks have is due to the fact that they've come back in and replaced this section of track. And if you look at the prototype railroad, there actually are examples of different concrete tie types. They look sort of different because they're made by different manufacturers. So anyway, I don't want to get too much into those nitty-gritty details. There's not necessarily a great reason for it. I just wanted to point out that I had already done a bit of weathering. Now I'm coming back and doing it with an airbrush, and not only that, I have 2 different kinds of tracks. So that's what's all going on here, but for the most part, let's just focus on how to weather track with an airbrush. So let's get started. So as I said, some of the weathering was already done, including the wooden tie sections, but much of the concrete tie track in this entire scene along the wall here has not been weathered. So for those sections, we'll use 2 steps today. The first is painting the ties. Just in general, we'll give it a light dusting of paint, and then after that we'll mask off the ties and weather the rails. So before we start, there are really 2 things I need to do to prepare the area that I'll be working in. First things first, I'm going to make an overspray mask. I don't think this is too important because in hindsight there wasn't really too much overspray, but I guess it's a good idea to cover up the backdrop. So I just took some leftover paper I had and then put some double-sided tape on the back of that, and then we were good to go for protecting the backdrop. And then for all the adjacent sections of track that already have been weathered, I was sure to cover those up with some 1-inch masking tape. Again, in hindsight, it probably would have been more efficient to use masking tape that was like 2 inches or something like that, but we got it done. And I should mention that at this point there's really no need for me to mask off any portions of the track that we are weathering, because we're just going to give it a generic light coat of paint just all over, and then afterwards we will paint the rails specifically. So with the masking all complete, it was time to mix our paint for part 1 of weathering. For this I wanted really just an off-white sort of concrete color, so I of course took some white acrylic paint, but I also mixed in a tad of tan paint. And these are just cheap acrylics that I got from Michael's or any art supply store really. And as I've sort of alluded to already, the goal for this first section of weathering is really just to give the entirety of the track, but specifically the ties, a flatter, less plasticky look. And this layer is not necessarily a thick, opaque coating. I want it to be, as I've already said, just sort of like a light dusting. It'll act as an accent color. So I'm not too worried about getting the exact paint mixture a perfect color, since it'll just sort of add to the tie color that's already there. And now it's finally time for painting. I should just show you really quick that for this project I used a very battle-scarred dual-action Iwata airbrush, and then also an air compressor that looks like it's straight out of the Bronze Age. After loading some paint into the airbrush, I just passed over all of the concrete ties with this sort of whitish gray mixture. It's really difficult to actually see the progress on camera, so that's why I don't have a lot of in-action video right here. But even in person, the effect is pretty subtle. So I mean, if you guys were really happy with the tie color of the Atlas track or microengineering, and let's say that you happen to want to weather your track, this could be a step that you skip. I just think it really flattens the ties. I mean, like appearance-wise, it gets rid of the sheen, and it just makes them look a little more mineralized and concrete-like. In this shot, you can sort of vaguely detect how the ties have been dusted over, and as I mentioned, there's a bit of sheen that's been taken away from the plastic ties, so they look a little more 3D and a little more like they're actually made out of rock material. So that's really all there is to the first step. So now it's time to move on to the second and final part, which is painting the rails. For this step, I needed to mask off all of the ties, which we had just painted, but I want to leave the rails and then the rail clips exposed. So to mask in between the rails, my 1-inch wide masking tape was a bit too wide, so I just cut it in half using an X-Acto blade, and then taking those narrower strips, I aligned them with the edge of the rail clips inside of the rails, and then once I had one side done, I did the same thing for the other inside rail, so that the cut or jagged edge sort of overlapped in the middle of the rails, if you know what I mean. And then I did the same thing, but on the outside of the rails. So as you can see in this shot, I left nothing exposed except for those rails and rail clips, because if you look at prototype photos, generally those rail clips themselves are metallic, and they wind up being pretty much the same color as the rails themselves. So I just want to paint those details as well as the web of the rail all at one time. So once again, I mixed some paint together in my very high-tech former White Castle cup, and for this paint mixture I wanted really a deep brownish gray color, so I mixed together some earth brown, a bit of beige, just a tad of black, and then some burnt umber, which has more of a red rusty color to it. And I didn't necessarily have a specific mixture in mind. I just sort of mixed it together till it looks good. And now, of course, with our paint mix, it's time to actually airbrush the rails. Painting the rails, to me, is almost the easier part, just because you can actually track your progress. When you're spraying the ties a concrete color, it doesn't really look like you're doing much. But in this case, as you see in the video, you can actually see the paint being applied. So I just went over it with a few passes in a variety of angles, so that afterwards the track looked evenly weathered from all perspectives, and I just made sure to cover as much of the rail and rail clips as possible so that we didn't have any reflective nickel silver showing afterwards. And I have to say, the most satisfying step out of all of this is peeling off the masking tape once you've painted the rails, and as you can see here, it just exposes a freshly weathered track that looks very uniform and well weathered. And as I just mentioned, assuming that you get the tape, the masking tape on straight, what's great about this method is when you peel the masking tape off, you have a very uniform look to the rails and just the track in general. And the problem I was having before when I was doing the hand brushed method is that there's just enough human error that it's difficult to get the rail clips all painted evenly and perfectly. So I find the airbrushing method, although it takes some time to mask the actual track, once you get the paint applied and peel the masking tape off, it all looks very good and much more natural than doing it by hand. In this closer shot, you can see how dull and metallic the rails and rail clips look, but of course you can also see there's a bit of overspray around the rail clips themselves. Of course, this is really unavoidable and not that big of a deal, because on the prototypes there's usually a bit of rusty runoff that stains the concrete ties around the rail clips anyway. And there's one last step, which is of course to scrape the paint off of the rail heads. In this shot you can see me doing that with a razor blade, but I actually found that a scrap piece of hardboard worked best. I just ran that down both rails at the same time and it scrapes the paint right off, which is a lot easier than doing it with a razor blade. Now I called it done at this point, but of course I know other people would add some weathering powders along the rails before they finish up, but I like the two-step process I've got going here. So if I feel later that I should do the weathering powders before I add the ballast, I'll go ahead and do that, but I think the track looks pretty good as is, so we'll call it a day there. Well guys, that's just about going to wrap this video up. I still need to work that way and finish up the track weathering up around the curve, and I'll get to that in a second. But as you just saw, we finished up this section of track right in here, and it looks pretty good and is well matched with the piece of track that I'd already weathered. And most importantly, now I am able to go back in and we'll finish up our overpass scene. I have all those pieces and parts over here. So now that that track's weathered, there's nothing really holding me back from putting all the pieces in place, painting them, and then we'll get to some scenery. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, of course, leave those below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I'll see you guys next time.